Daughter abandoned her mother for a life of luxury, but karma had other plans for her. Now, the daughter has been thrown out of her own home with a baby in her arms and no one to turn to for help. She's on the doorstep of the woman she cheated on, but will she forgive her? Clara Matthews was the embodiment of unconditional maternal love. A modest woman with a warm smile and hands roughened by years of hard work, she had dedicated her entire life to raising her only daughter, Melissa. As a single mother, Clara had faced countless challenges, yet she never hesitated to put Melissa's well-being first. Working as a seamstress in a small tailor shop, she saved every penny to ensure that Melissa had what Clara herself never did: opportunities. Melissa, on the other hand, was a young woman full of ambition and dreams. From an early age, she yearned to escape the financial limitations of her childhood. Intelligent and determined, Melissa respected her mother but carried a shadow of resentment. To her, Clara symbolized a past she was desperate to leave behind. When Melissa married Ethan Blake, a charismatic and successful man, it seemed all her dreams had come true. Together, they moved into a luxurious home in an affluent neighborhood, and Melissa's life transformed into something out of a movie. However, the sparkle of this new life quickly became suffocating for Clara. When Melissa invited her mother to live with them, Clara believed she could help by taking care of the house and supporting her daughter as she planned for a future family with Ethan. Yet Ethan, with his charming smile and calculated words, never welcomed her presence. To him, Clara was an unwelcome reminder of his wife's humble beginnings. Subtly, he began planting seeds in Melissa's mind. Clara was a burden, an unnecessary weight on their perfect new life. Melissa, swayed by Ethan's words and the allure of a picture-perfect future, began to see her mother in a different light. Every act of care from Clara, once viewed as thoughtful, now felt intrusive. Melissa didn't hesitate to confront her. "You've always done so much for me, Mom," she began, her voice hesitant but firm. "But now I need to focus on my life. I think it's time for you to focus on yours too." Clara was stunned. The words, polished yet piercing, cut deeper than any shouted argument ever could. Her daughter, the very reason for all her sacrifices, was asking her to leave. Understanding the pride driving Melissa and Ethan's influence, Clara knew staying would only bring more conflict. With tears in her eyes but her dignity intact, she packed her few belongings and left the house she had once believed would be a safe haven. As Melissa and Ethan resumed their luxurious routines, Clara faced the biting chill of the night, utterly alone. Yet even in her pain, she clung to her faith. Sitting on a park bench with her small suitcase beside her, Clara looked up at the stars and whispered, "I gave her everything I had, and I'd do it all again." Clara's first nights away from her daughter's home were the hardest. Sitting in a makeshift shelter in the neighborhood where she had once raised Melissa, she watched people walk by briskly, their faces indifferent. The autumn air was harsh, but not as unrelenting as the ache in her heart. Melissa's rejection had left a wound that pulsed with every memory of her daughter's determined yet cold expression. Back in the sprawling home that Clara could no longer call her own, Melissa tried to adjust to the harmony Ethan had promised. But her mother's absence, once a constant source of comfort, left a silence that lingered. The small, thoughtful acts Clara had done, like preparing breakfast or asking about her day, were gone, leaving an unspoken void. Ethan, however, appeared more content than ever. With his polished demeanor, he reinforced the idea that their decision was the right one. "Your mom needed to learn to stand on her own, Melissa. It's not fair to drag the past into the future we're building," he said smoothly. Melissa nodded in agreement, but the unease in her chest grew steadily stronger. Meanwhile, Clara refused to let despair consume her. On her first morning without a home, she resolved to find work again, regardless of how modest the opportunity. After hours of walking through the city streets, she came across a small tailor shop in need of help with alterations. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. As days turned into weeks, Clara began forging connections with others who shared similar struggles. In a small community of homeless individuals and laborers, she found kindness and moments of hope. Despite her circumstances, Clara's compassionate nature shone through, often sharing what little she had with those who seemed even more desperate. However, as Clara fought to rebuild her life, cracks began to form in Melissa and Ethan's seemingly perfect world. Ethan, once attentive and loving, revealed a controlling and self-centered side. Minor disagreements escalated into heated arguments, with Ethan blaming Melissa for every issue that arose. One night, as Melissa held a glass of wine and gazed at the reflection of her pristine home, an uncomfortable thought crept into her mind. Her mother had always taught her that a true home was built on love, not marble walls or expensive furniture. But pride held her back, and she refused to admit how much she missed Clara. The fates, however, seemed determined to teach harsh lessons. Clara, though heartbroken, remained resilient, her faith unwavering. "You reap what you sow," she often reminded herself. "And I sowed love." Clara's days blurred into a relentless routine of survival. Each morning, she rose early to catch the first bus to the small tailor shop where she worked. Her hands, once skilled and steady, now ached from long hours of stitching hems and repairing torn fabrics. It wasn't much, but it gave her purpose, and just enough to buy food and save for a small room in a shared boarding house. At night, the emptiness of her new life crept in. Alone in the dimly lit boarding house, Clara often thought of Melissa. She wondered if her daughter ever felt the void she herself couldn't escape. She prayed for Melissa's happiness, even though her own heart felt hollow. "Love doesn't vanish," Clara would whisper to herself. "It endures, even when it isn't returned." Meanwhile, Melissa's life was unraveling in slow, agonizing increments. Ethan's charming facade was crumbling, revealing a man driven by pride and entitlement. Arguments between them became more frequent, and Ethan's patience waned as he dismissed Melissa's concerns with cutting remarks. "I didn't sign up for this," he snapped one evening when Melissa tried to discuss their strained finances. The cracks in their marriage were no longer subtle. Ethan's business ventures, once lucrative, had taken a downturn, and his temper grew short as he struggled to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. Melissa, who had once been captivated by Ethan's confidence, now found herself questioning his every decision. But as Melissa faced the growing instability in her marriage, Clara found unexpected strength in her new circumstances. The people in her boarding house, a mixture of elderly tenants and working-class individuals, became a source of quiet companionship. Among them was Sarah, a retired schoolteacher who spent her evenings knitting scarves for the homeless. "You have a good soul," Sarah told Clara one night as they shared a pot of tea. "I see it in the way you care for others. Even when you're hurting." Clara smiled faintly. "It's all I know. Giving up on love feels like giving up on life." As the weeks passed, Clara's resilience became a quiet defiance against the hardships she faced. She volunteered at a local soup kitchen on Sundays, spending her free time helping those even less fortunate than herself. The act of giving, no matter how small, filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since losing her home. Yet, in her heart, Clara carried the weight of a question that never left her. Did Melissa regret what she had done? Back in her lavish home, Melissa began to notice the cracks in her own reflection. She avoided her mother's name in conversation, but in the quiet hours of the night, memories of Clara haunted her. She recalled the way her mother would hum softly while mending clothes, or how Clara's laughter could brighten even the darkest of days. But Melissa's pride still held her captive. Despite the growing turmoil in her life, she couldn't bring herself to admit that casting Clara out had been a mistake. Instead, she buried her guilt beneath layers of frustration, directing her anger at Ethan and the fragile world they had built together. Unbeknownst to Melissa, the life she had so carefully crafted was on the verge of collapse. And as fate continued to weave its intricate threads, it became clear that both mother and daughter were being tested in ways neither could foresee. Clara had always believed that faith was her greatest ally in times of hardship. Even as she faced the stark reality of being cast out by the daughter she had sacrificed everything for, her trust in something greater remained unshaken. Each morning before leaving for work, Clara would sit by the small window of her boarding house room, hands clasped in prayer. She prayed for strength, for resilience, and most of all, for Melissa's happiness. The tailor shop where Clara worked became a quiet refuge. The rhythmic hum of sewing machines and the familiarity of fabric in her hands gave her a sense of stability. Her employer, Mr. Reynolds, a kind but reserved man, quickly noticed Clara's meticulous work and dedication. "You have a gift, Mrs. Matthews," he told her one afternoon as she finished hemming a delicate wedding dress. "This place is better with you here." Clara smiled, grateful for the small kindness. It was a reminder that her value didn't depend on anyone's approval but her own. On Sundays, Clara began volunteering at the local soup kitchen. It was a bustling place, filled with people from all walks of life who had fallen on hard times. Clara found solace in serving others, whether it was pouring cups of steaming coffee or offering a warm smile to someone in need. One particular Sunday, an elderly woman named Margaret approached Clara with trembling hands. "You remind me of my daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I haven't seen her in years. I think about her every day." Clara's heart ached at Margaret's words. She gently squeezed the woman's hand and replied, "Sometimes love is patient, waiting for the right time to heal. Don't give up on her." Those words lingered in Clara's mind as she walked home that evening. Love, she believed, was not only about forgiveness but also about endurance. And no matter how much Melissa had hurt her, Clara knew that her love for her daughter would never waver. Ethan, whose patience for their increasingly strained finances had run dry, began spending more nights away from home. Melissa was left alone in the echoing halls of their luxurious house, with no one to confide in. Her frustration grew as she realized that the foundation of her marriage was crumbling, and Ethan's charm had been replaced by cold indifference. One night, as Melissa sat in the dimly lit kitchen, scrolling aimlessly through photos on her phone, she stumbled upon an image of herself and Clara from years ago. They were standing in front of their modest old home, smiling brightly despite their humble surroundings. Melissa's throat tightened as she remembered how proud Clara had been to take the photo. But instead of letting the memory soften her, Melissa pushed it aside. "That life is over," she muttered under her breath, though the words felt hollow. For Clara, hope began to manifest in small but meaningful ways. One evening, while returning from the soup kitchen, she noticed a flyer pinned to a lamppost advertising a local church's community group. The words, "Healing Through Connection," stood out to her, and she decided to attend. The group met in a small, warmly lit room in the church basement. It was filled with people sharing their struggles and finding solace in one another's stories. Clara listened intently as a young man spoke about reconciling with his estranged family. When it was Clara's turn to share, she hesitated. But after a moment, she said, "I lost my home and my daughter all at once, but I haven't lost my love for her. That's the one thing keeping me going." The group leader, a gentle woman named Linda, smiled and replied, "Love is powerful, Clara. It has a way of coming back to us, even when we least expect it." As Clara walked home that night, the stars seemed brighter, as if the universe itself was whispering encouragement. She held onto Linda's words and her unwavering faith, trusting that love would find its way back into her life, no matter how long it took. Melissa's days were marked by surface-level perfection. Her home, a sprawling modern mansion with pristine white walls and polished marble floors, stood as a testament to her ambition. But behind the facade of luxury, cracks were forming. Cracks that Melissa refused to acknowledge, even as they grew impossible to ignore. Ethan, the man she once adored for his confidence and charisma, had become distant and irritable. He spent more time at work, or so he claimed, often returning home late without offering any explanation. Melissa began to notice inconsistencies. Vague text messages, unexplained charges on their shared credit card, and the cold edge in Ethan's tone whenever she questioned him. "You're overthinking things," Ethan said dismissively one evening as Melissa confronted him about his long absences. "I have enough to deal with at work without you adding more stress." Melissa wanted to believe him, to cling to the image of the life they had built together. But her unease only deepened. She threw herself into maintaining the appearance of perfection, hosting dinners, attending charity galas, and decorating the house with lavish furniture. Yet each effort felt increasingly hollow, as if she were trying to distract herself from a truth she wasn't ready to face. The weight of her decisions began to press heavily on Melissa. Though she rarely allowed herself to dwell on the past, memories of Clara often crept in during her quiet moments. She recalled how her mother's humble presence had once been a source of comfort and stability. Clara's quiet strength had been a guiding force in Melissa's life, a force she now realized was sorely missing. But instead of reaching out, Melissa buried her guilt. She rationalized her choices, convincing herself that Clara was better off without the burden of her daughter's new life. "She's strong," Melissa told herself repeatedly. "She'll figure things out, like she always has." Yet even as she clung to these justifications, the tension in her marriage began to mirror the inner conflict Melissa tried so hard to suppress. Ethan's temper grew shorter with each passing day. Their arguments, once rare, became a regular occurrence. One evening, as they sat in silence over a dinner that Melissa had spent hours preparing, Ethan finally broke. "Do you ever think about how much I've sacrificed for us?" he snapped. Melissa stared at him, stunned. "Sacrificed? You have everything you could ever want." Ethan laughed bitterly. "And what about what I want? You think this is all just about you, Melissa?" The words stung. For the first time, Melissa saw a version of Ethan she didn't recognize, a man driven by selfishness and resentment rather than love. Melissa's unease continued to grow. One morning, she overheard a hushed phone call that Ethan quickly ended the moment she entered the room. His excuses were smooth, but Melissa couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. That same week, she received a phone call from an old college friend. During their casual conversation, the friend mentioned seeing Ethan at a downtown restaurant with another woman. "It was probably just a work meeting," her friend added quickly, sensing Melissa's discomfort. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Alone in the cavernous silence of her home, Melissa found herself reaching for her phone late at night, scrolling through photos of her childhood. The image of her mother's warm smile stared back at her, a stark contrast to the cold, empty life Melissa now inhabited. But her pride remained her greatest barrier. Admitting she missed Clara felt like conceding defeat, and Melissa was too stubborn to allow herself that vulnerability. She resolved to handle her problems on her own, even as the foundation of her life grew increasingly unstable. Meanwhile, Clara's quiet strength grew stronger each day. Unbeknownst to Melissa, her mother's life was slowly piecing itself back together. Clara had no knowledge of the turmoil brewing in her daughter's life, but her prayers for Melissa's happiness never ceased. As fate's hand began to tighten its grip, the lives of mother and daughter seemed destined to intersect once more. But when that moment came, Melissa would not be the same woman who cast her mother aside, and Clara would prove that true love could withstand even the greatest of betrayals. Melissa's once enviable life began to feel like a house of cards, teetering under the weight of secrets and lies. Ethan's absences grew more frequent, his explanations vaguer. Melissa, who had always prided herself on being in control, felt the stability of her marriage slipping through her fingers. One evening, while Ethan was out meeting a client, Melissa sat in their lavish living room, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media. Her mind wandered to the past, to memories of her mother. She remembered how Clara had always been there, her quiet strength a comforting constant in an otherwise turbulent life. But before Melissa could sink too deeply into her thoughts, the doorbell rang. It was a courier delivering an envelope addressed to Ethan. Melissa accepted it, her curiosity piqued. Inside, she found an invoice for an expensive piece of jewelry, something she had never received. Her heart sank, the implications impossible to ignore. When Ethan returned later that night, Melissa confronted him. "I found this," she said, holding up the invoice. "Care to explain?" Ethan's face hardened. "It's a gift for a client," he replied coolly. "You wouldn't understand how these things work." Melissa wanted to believe him, but the coldness in his tone and the flicker of guilt in his eyes made it impossible. The doubt that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. "A client? Or someone else?" she demanded. Ethan's temper flared. "If you're going to start playing the jealous wife, I don't have time for this," he snapped, grabbing his keys and leaving the house without another word. As the sound of the door slamming echoed through the empty halls, Melissa felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The man she had built her life around was slipping further and further away, and for the first time, she began to question whether he had ever truly loved her at all. In the days that followed, Ethan's behavior grew even more erratic. Melissa overheard him taking phone calls in hushed tones, his back turned to her as if shielding his conversations. She noticed small, telling signs: the faint smell of perfume on his clothes, a lipstick stain on his collar. Yet every time she mustered the courage to confront him, Ethan dismissed her concerns with the same rehearsed indifference. Melissa began to feel the walls closing in. She spent her days pacing the house, her mind racing with scenarios she couldn't control. The luxurious surroundings she had once cherished now felt suffocating, their grandeur mocking her crumbling marriage. One night, unable to sleep, Melissa wandered into the nursery she had so carefully decorated for the baby she and Ethan had planned to have. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated the tiny crib and pastel walls, a stark contrast to the darkness she felt inside. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "What happened to us?" The shadows over Melissa's life grew heavier when she found a photograph tucked inside an old drawer while cleaning one afternoon. It was of her and Clara, taken years ago in front of their modest home. Melissa had a bright smile on her face, her arms wrapped around her mother, who was holding a freshly baked pie. The memory hit Melissa like a tidal wave. She remembered the simplicity of those days, the warmth of her mother's love, the security Clara had provided even when they had so little. For the first time, Melissa allowed herself to acknowledge the void Clara's absence had left in her life. But guilt and pride kept her from reaching out. "I can't go back," she muttered, placing the photograph back in the drawer. "Not after what I've done." Despite her attempts to maintain control, Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to collapse. At a charity event Ethan insisted they attend together, Melissa overheard whispers about his recent business dealings. The words "financial trouble" and "risky investments" reached her ears, sending a chill down her spine. Ethan, ever the charmer, laughed off her concerns when she brought them up later that night. "People love to talk," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Don't let their nonsense get to you." But Melissa couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The shadows over her life were growing darker, and the perfect world she had worked so hard to create was beginning to crack. Unbeknownst to her, fate was setting the stage for a moment that would force Melissa to confront her choices and seek redemption in the unlikeliest of places: her mother's unwavering love. While Melissa's world grew increasingly fragile, Clara's resilience continued to blossom, supported by the unexpected allies she found in her new life. The boarding house where she lived had become more than just a shelter. It was a community. Its tenants were an eclectic mix of people who had faced their own struggles, and their shared stories brought a sense of camaraderie that Clara hadn't experienced in years. One of Clara's closest connections was Sarah, a retired schoolteacher who had been widowed and left without family. Sarah's sharp wit and empathetic nature drew Clara in, and the two women quickly became friends. "You know," Sarah said one evening as they shared a modest dinner in the boarding house's communal kitchen, "you remind me of myself when I was younger, always giving, always sacrificing for others. It's a beautiful thing, but don't forget to care for yourself too." Clara smiled softly. "It's not in my nature to stop caring for others, even when it hurts." Through Sarah, Clara was introduced to a small network of women in the community who supported one another in rebuilding their lives. These women, many of whom had experienced similar hardships, shared tips for finding work, managing limited resources, and regaining a sense of purpose. One day, Sarah approached Clara with a surprising suggestion. "There's a community market happening this weekend," she said. "You should set up a little booth with your sewing. People are always looking for custom repairs or alterations." Clara hesitated at first. "I've only ever worked in a shop. I'm not sure I'd know how to run a booth," she admitted. "Nonsense," Sarah replied with a grin. "You have the skills and you have the heart. The rest will follow." Encouraged by Sarah's words, Clara decided to take a chance. With the help of her new friends, she gathered her sewing materials and set up a modest table at the market. To her surprise, People flocked to her booth, impressed by the quality of her work. By the end of the day, Clara had earned more than she ever expected. But more importantly, she felt a renewed sense of pride in herself, a feeling that had been missing since she left Melissa's home. Word of Clara's skill began to spread. Over the following weeks, more people from the community sought her out for alterations and custom pieces. Her reputation grew, and with it, so did her confidence. One customer, a middle-aged man named Tom, owned a small fabric store nearby. Impressed by Clara's work, he offered her discounted supplies and even referred clients to her. "I've been in this business for years," Tom told her, "and let me tell you, talent like yours is rare. You've got something special." For the first time in months, Clara felt a glimmer of hope for her future. While she still missed Melissa deeply, her days were no longer consumed by sorrow. Instead, they were filled with purpose and the warmth of a community that valued her. Through her new allies, Clara learned the importance of leaning on others, even as she remained fiercely independent. Sarah, ever the optimist, often reminded her, "Life has a funny way of surprising you. The love you give out always finds its way back to you." Though Clara couldn't yet see how, she held on to Sarah's words. With each small victory, a successful market day, a kind word from a customer, or an encouraging note from a friend, Clara felt her faith growing stronger. Unbeknownst to her, these connections and small victories were preparing Clara for a future she couldn't yet imagine. And as her life began to stabilize, fate was already at work, drawing Melissa closer to a moment that would bring her back into her mother's world, humbled and desperate for forgiveness. As Clara's reputation for her sewing skills grew within the community, so did the opportunities that came her way. One evening, after a particularly busy day at the community market, Clara returned to the boarding house to find a letter waiting for her. It was an elegant envelope, unlike the usual bills or advertisements she received. Her name was written in neat cursive, and the return address was from a local boutique she had never heard of before. Curious but cautious, Clara opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. The letter was from a woman named Margaret, the owner of a boutique specializing in handmade clothing and custom tailoring. Margaret had heard about Clara's work through a mutual contact, Tom, the fabric store owner, and was interested in collaborating with her. "Your craftsmanship has caught the attention of some of my clients," the letter read. "I would love to discuss the possibility of incorporating your talents into my boutique's offerings. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." Clara's heart raced as she read the words. The boutique world was something she had never imagined herself being part of. For years, her sewing had been a means of survival, a practical skill to get by. But now, someone was recognizing her work as something extraordinary, something worth showcasing. Clara held the letter in her trembling hands, excitement mingling with apprehension. Could she really take this step? Memories of her humble beginnings resurfaced, along with the ever-present doubt that had lingered since Melissa's rejection. She shared the news with Sarah over tea that evening, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "It sounds too good to be true," Clara admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" Sarah's eyes sparkled with determination. "Clara, you've survived more than most people ever will. This isn't about failing or succeeding. It's about believing in yourself and taking the opportunities life gives you. You owe it to yourself to try." Buoyed by Sarah's encouragement, Clara resolved to call Margaret the next morning. As she placed the letter on her small desk and prepared for bed, a strange sense of anticipation filled the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that this opportunity was more than just a chance to grow her work. It was the start of something transformative. But unknown to Clara, her life wasn't the only one on the brink of change. Across town, Melissa's fragile world was unraveling faster than ever, pushing her closer to a moment of reckoning she couldn't avoid. As Clara turned off the light and closed her eyes, she whispered a prayer, unaware of how soon fate would test her strength and compassion once again. Melissa's carefully curated world was beginning to crumble. The once loving relationship she had built with Ethan had become cold and distant, with each passing day adding another layer of suspicion. Ethan's excuses were flimsy, his behavior more erratic, and the late nights away from home had turned into a routine Melissa could no longer ignore. One afternoon, while tidying up Ethan's study, Melissa stumbled upon something she couldn't explain. Hidden in the back of a drawer was a receipt for a luxury hotel, dated just 2 nights earlier. The handwriting scrawled across the receipt confirmed a reservation for 2. Her breath caught as her stomach tightened in disbelief. That evening, Melissa waited for Ethan to return, the receipt clenched in her trembling hand. She rehearsed what she would say, but no amount of preparation could steady her nerves. When Ethan finally walked through the door, she wasted no time. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp as she thrust the receipt toward him. Ethan's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. "Melissa, I don't have the energy for your paranoia right now," he said, brushing past her. "Don't walk away from me." Melissa's voice cracked, the weight of her frustration boiling over. "You've been lying to me, haven't you? Who were you with?" Ethan turned, his face twisting into a scowl. "You want the truth? Fine. I've been seeing someone else," he spat. His words were like a dagger, cutting through the air and leaving Melissa breathless. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to me? After everything we've been through?" Ethan shrugged, his cold indifference only deepening the wound. "Maybe if you spent less time clinging to the past and more time being the woman I married, we wouldn't be here." The confrontation escalated quickly. Ethan's mask of charm and confidence was gone, replaced by a bitter, selfish man Melissa no longer recognized. When she refused to leave the matter unresolved, Ethan delivered the final blow. "I'm done with this, Melissa. I'm done with you." He grabbed a suitcase from the closet and began tossing in her belongings with a chilling calmness. "I want you out by tomorrow." Melissa's mind spun in disbelief. "You're throwing me out? Where am I supposed to go?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "That's not my problem. Take your kid and figure it out." Those words shattered whatever strength Melissa had left. Clutching her infant son to her chest, she realized that the life she had built, the home she had worked so hard to protect, was gone. Melissa spent the next hours in a daze, packing the essentials while her baby slept in his crib. The echoes of her argument with Ethan rang in her ears, each word replaying with unbearable clarity. When the sun rose the next morning, Melissa walked out of the house she had once called her dream home. A single suitcase in one hand and her baby in the other, she found herself standing on the curb, unsure of where to go. The weight of her choices, her pride, and her betrayal of Clara bore down on her like a storm. For the first time in years, Melissa allowed herself to admit the truth. She had been wrong. There was only one place she could think to go, one person she hoped would still be willing to forgive her. Melissa stood on the sidewalk, her baby bundled in her arms, staring at the unfamiliar streets around her. The early morning air was crisp and biting, and she tightened her grip on her child's blanket, shielding him from the chill. Tears streamed silently down her face as reality sank in. She had nowhere to go. Her once perfect life was gone. The lavish house she had adored now nothing more than a memory. Melissa clung to the baby, her last connection to a life she barely recognized anymore. Her pride, which had carried her so far, now felt like a weight pulling her further into despair. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Names of acquaintances, former colleagues, and distant friends flashed before her, but none of them felt like people she could turn to. The few she had trusted over the years were either too distant or had already warned her about Ethan. To call them now would only invite pity or judgment, neither of which Melissa could bear. Her options were dwindling, and with them her resolve. Melissa wandered aimlessly for hours, her suitcase trailing behind her, the baby stirring fitfully in her arms. She passed bustling cafes, crowded parks, and busy sidewalks, feeling more invisible with every step. Hunger gnawed at her, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The idea of returning to Clara had been simmering in the back of her mind since Ethan had first thrown her out. But the thought of facing her mother after all she had done was unbearable. Melissa had turned her back on Clara, humiliated her, and cast her out when she needed support the most. How could she now ask for help from the very person she had betrayed? But as the hours passed and her baby began to cry, Melissa realized she had no choice. Her mother was the only person she could trust, the only one who might still care for her despite everything. Gathering what little courage she had left, Melissa hailed a cab and gave the driver the address she remembered as Clara's last known home. During the ride, she rehearsed what she would say, her hands trembling as she clutched her child closer. Would Clara even speak to her? Would she turn her away, as Melissa had done so cruelly? The fear of rejection gnawed at her, but the cries of her baby drowned out her doubts. She had to try, for his sake if not for her own. When the cab pulled up to the modest boarding house, Melissa hesitated before stepping out. She stared at the unassuming building, so different from the home they had once shared. Her chest tightened as memories of her mother's warmth flooded back. Taking a deep breath, she approached the front door and knocked softly. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, and Melissa's heart raced as she waited. When the door finally opened, Clara stood on the other side, her face etched with surprise and concern. She looked at Melissa, her disheveled appearance and tear-streaked face, and then at the baby in her arms. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Melissa's voice cracked as she broke the silence. "Mom, I need your help." Clara's expression softened, her eyes filling with tears. Without hesitation, she reached out and pulled Melissa and the baby into her arms. "Come in," Clara said, her voice steady and full of love. In that moment, Melissa felt the walls she had built around her heart crumble. The shame, the guilt, and the pride that had kept her away from Clara dissolved in her mother's embrace. Melissa whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." Clara held her tightly, stroking her hair as she replied, "You're home now. That's all that matters." The room was small and humble, with the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air from a candle Clara had lit earlier that day. But to Melissa, it felt like stepping into a sanctuary. She hadn't realized just how much she missed the warmth of her mother's presence until she crossed that threshold. Clara guided Melissa to the worn couch in the corner of the room. "Sit down," she said gently, her voice calm but concerned. "You look exhausted." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a steaming cup of tea and a small blanket, placing them on the coffee table before sitting beside her daughter. Melissa cradled her baby, who had finally settled into a restless sleep. Her hands shook slightly as she accepted the tea, and she avoided Clara's gaze, unsure of how to begin. Clara broke the silence first. "What happened, Melissa?" she asked softly, her tone free of judgment but heavy with worry. Tears welled up in Melissa's eyes. She hadn't expected such tenderness after how she had treated her mother. "Ethan, he threw me out," she confessed, her voice cracking. "He's been cheating on me, and when I confronted him, he told me to leave. I have nowhere else to go." Clara's heart ached as she listened. Seeing her daughter in such pain was unbearable, but she didn't interrupt. She placed a comforting hand on Melissa's shoulder, silently urging her to continue. "And it's my fault," Melissa continued, her tears falling freely now. "I was so blinded by the life I thought I wanted. Pushed you away, Mom. I thought I didn't need you anymore. But now I see how wrong I was." Melissa's voice broke into a sob, and Clara pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Shh," Clara murmured, stroking her hair like she had when Melissa was a child. "You don't have to say anything else. You're here now, and that's all that matters." Despite everything Melissa had done, Clara felt no anger or resentment. Her heart was filled with love, a love that had only grown stronger during their time apart. "We all make mistakes, sweetheart," Clara said quietly. "What matters is what we do to make things right." Melissa pulled back slightly, wiping her tears. "I don't deserve your kindness, Mom," she admitted. "After the way I treated you, I wouldn't blame you if you told me to leave." Clara shook her head firmly. "You're my daughter, Melissa. I could never turn you away. No matter what's happened, my love for you hasn't changed. And now you have a little one to think about. Let's focus on what we can do to move forward." Her words brought a flicker of hope to Melissa's eyes. For the first time in weeks, She felt a glimmer of safety, a sense that things might someday be okay. As if sensing the change in the room, the baby stirred and let out a soft cry. Clara leaned forward, her expression softening as she reached out her arms. "May I?" she asked. Melissa hesitated for a moment, then nodded, carefully placing the baby in Clara's arms. Watching her mother hold her child brought a rush of emotion that Melissa couldn't fully explain. It was as if a bridge was being rebuilt, spanning the distance that had grown between them. Clara cradled the baby gently, her voice soft and soothing as she spoke. "He's beautiful, Melissa. What's his name?" "His name is Oliver," Melissa replied, her voice steadier now. Clara smiled. "Hello, Oliver," she whispered. "You're going to be okay. We're all going to be okay." That night, Clara prepared a simple dinner, the three of them sharing their first meal together in what felt like a lifetime. Though the path ahead was uncertain, the warmth of their reunion provided a sense of hope that hadn't existed before. For Melissa, the hardest part, admitting she needed her mother, was over. Now, as she watched Clara gently rock Oliver to sleep, she felt something she hadn't in years: gratitude. And for Clara, the return of her daughter and the chance to be part of her grandson's life was nothing short of a blessing. She didn't dwell on the pain of the past. Instead, she looked forward to the healing that awaited them both. The first few days at Clara's modest home were a whirlwind of emotions for Melissa. While Clara treated her with kindness and understanding, Melissa found herself overwhelmed by guilt. Every corner of the small room reminded her of how far she had fallen, and how deeply she had hurt the one person who truly loved her unconditionally. Late one night, while Clara rocked Oliver to sleep, Melissa sat by the window, staring at the moonlit street below. Her thoughts raced as memories of her past choices played on an endless loop in her mind. She remembered the way Clara had looked at her on the day she asked her to leave. Those kind eyes filled with heartbreak and betrayal. Melissa's stomach twisted as she recalled Ethan's cold words, words that had mirrored her own when she cast Clara aside. "I let myself become someone I didn't recognize," Melissa whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "I chose him over her, over everything she gave me." The next morning, Melissa decided she couldn't hold her feelings in any longer. As Clara sat at the table mending a dress, Melissa took a deep breath and sat across from her. "Mom," she began, her voice hesitant. "I need to say something. I don't even know if you'll want to hear it, but I have to say it anyway." Clara set her needle and thread down, giving her full attention to her daughter. "Of course, Melissa. What's on your mind?" Tears welled up in Melissa's eyes as she tried to find the right words. "I've been carrying so much guilt about what I did to you, about how I treated you. When I told you to leave, I thought I was doing the right thing, the smart thing. But now I see how wrong I was, how cruel I was." Clara's expression remained calm, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. She didn't interrupt, letting Melissa pour her heart out. "I chose Ethan over you," Melissa continued, her voice breaking. "I let him convince me that you were a burden, that I didn't need you anymore. But the truth is, I needed you more than ever. I was just too blind to see it." Clara reached across the table and took Melissa's trembling hands in her own. "Melissa," she said softly, "we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we realize them." "I don't know how to make it right," Melissa admitted. "I don't know if I can ever make it up to you." Clara smiled gently. "You already are. You came back. That's enough for me. And as long as we have each other, we can work through anything." Melissa's tears flowed freely now, but for the first time, they felt like a release, a weight being lifted from her chest. She had spent so long running from her mistakes, but now, facing them head-on with Clara's support, she felt a spark of hope. Over the following days, Melissa and Clara began to rebuild their relationship. Melissa started helping Clara with her sewing projects, sitting beside her as they worked together on custom orders for the boutique. In those quiet moments, Melissa learned more about the struggles Clara had faced after being cast out, nights spent on park benches, her eventual job at the tailor shop, and the friends she had made along the way. Each story deepened Melissa's appreciation for her mother's strength and resilience. "You've been through so much," Melissa said one evening as they folded fabric together. "And you still found a way to forgive me." Clara looked at her daughter, her gaze steady and kind. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Melissa. It's about choosing love over anger. And I love you too much to hold on to anger." For Melissa, Clara's words became a guiding light. She began to see that redemption wasn't about erasing the past but learning from it and moving forward with humility and gratitude. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. With Clara by her side, Melissa was finally ready to face whatever challenges life brought her way. Life in Clara's small home began to settle into a comforting routine. The days were simple but filled with purpose. And for Melissa, it was a sharp contrast to the cold luxury she had left behind. Each moment spent with her mother and baby Oliver felt like a step toward healing. But the road to recovery was far from smooth. Despite Clara's unwavering support, Melissa still struggled with feelings of shame and uncertainty. She had lost everything she thought she needed to be happy: her marriage, her home, and her sense of self-worth. What remained was fragile and unfamiliar, like a puzzle with missing pieces. One evening, as Clara rocked Oliver to sleep, Melissa sat at the table, staring blankly at a pile of fabric scraps. Her mother had been encouraging her to learn sewing, hoping it might give Melissa a sense of purpose and independence. But Melissa doubted her ability to create anything worthwhile. "What's the point?" she murmured, more to herself than to Clara. "I've already failed at everything else. Why would this be any different?" Clara set Oliver down gently in his crib and walked over to Melissa. She pulled up a chair, her warm smile softening Melissa's despair. "It's not about being perfect," Clara said, placing a hand over Melissa's. "It's about trying, taking one small step, even if it feels like you're not ready. That's how you find your way." The next day, Clara took Melissa with her to the boutique where she had begun collaborating on custom tailoring projects. Margaret, the boutique owner, greeted them warmly and introduced Melissa to the small but bustling workspace. "You must be Melissa," Margaret said, extending a hand. "Your mother's told me a lot about you." Melissa hesitated, feeling out of place among the bolts of fabric and busy seamstresses. "I'm not sure I'm much help here," she admitted, glancing nervously at Clara. "Nonsense," Margaret replied with a kind smile. "Everyone starts somewhere. And if you're half as talented as your mother, I'm sure you'll pick it up in no time." Margaret handed Melissa a simple project, hemming a set of curtains. Though her stitches were uneven and slow, Melissa felt a flicker of pride as she worked. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she was contributing to something, even in a small way. That evening, back at Clara's home, Melissa showed her mother the finished curtains. "They're not perfect," she said, holding them up with a sheepish smile. Clara's eyes lit up as she examined the stitches. "They're beautiful, Melissa. And so are you." Melissa's chest tightened, her mother's words filling her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the curtains, it was the realization that she could create something, that she still had value. As they hung the curtains together, Melissa turned to Clara. "Thank you, Mom, for everything. I don't think I could do this without you." Clara pulled her daughter into a gentle embrace. "You don't have to do it alone," she said, "but you're stronger than you think. And I'll be here every step of the way." Later that night, as Melissa rocked Oliver to sleep, Clara sat by the window, lost in thought. She had noticed a spark in Melissa that hadn't been there before, a determination to rebuild her life. But Clara also knew how fragile that spark was. As Clara looked out into the quiet night, a knock at the door broke the silence. Startled, she rose to answer it. Standing on the other side was Margaret, holding a small envelope. "I thought I'd stop by," Margaret said with a smile. "There's something I think Melissa should see." Inside the envelope was a flyer for a sewing apprenticeship program sponsored by a local charity. It was an opportunity that could change Melissa's life, a chance to rebuild her confidence and independence. Clara turned the flyer over in her hands, her heart swelling with hope. But she also felt the weight of uncertainty. Would Melissa take the leap, or would her fears hold her back? As Clara closed the door and placed the flyer on the table, she whispered a quiet prayer. "Give her the strength to believe in herself Melissa sat at the small kitchen table, the morning sun casting a warm glow through the window. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, watching as Clara busied herself with preparing breakfast. There was a peacefulness in the simplicity of their routine that Melissa had never appreciated before. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the room, and for a moment, Melissa felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in years. "Mom, can I help with anything?" she asked, setting her cup down. Clara turned and smiled. "Actually, yes. Could you stir the batter for the pancakes? I think they'd be better with your touch today." Melissa joined her mother at the counter, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence. It was a small gesture, but it signified a growing partnership between them. As days turned into weeks, Melissa immersed herself in the sewing apprenticeship program Margaret had suggested. She was nervous at first, doubting her abilities, but Clara's unwavering encouragement gave her the confidence to persevere. One afternoon, after a particularly rewarding day at the workshop, Melissa returned home to find Clara sitting on the porch with Oliver on her lap. The baby giggled as Clara played peekaboo, his chubby hands reaching out to grasp her fingers. "Looks like someone's in a good mood," Melissa said, her heart warming at the sight. Clara looked up, her eyes shining. "He's been waiting for you." "We both have." Melissa sat beside them, and together they watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and orange. The tranquility of the moment prompted Melissa to share something that had been on her mind. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot lately," she began hesitantly, "about forgiveness and what it really means." Clara listened attentively, nodding for her to continue. "I used to think forgiveness was about accepting an apology or moving past something that hurt you," Melissa said. "But now I realize it's so much more than that. It's about understanding, empathy, and letting go of resentment. You've shown me that through everything you've done." Clara placed a gentle hand on Melissa's shoulder. Forgiveness can be a powerful healing tool, for both the one who gives it and the one who receives it. Melissa sighed softly. "I don't know if I could have been as forgiving as you are." Clara smiled. "You'd be surprised at the strength you have inside. And forgiveness isn't always easy, but it's necessary to move forward." Motivated by her mother's wisdom, Melissa decided to reach out to some of the people she had distanced herself from during her marriage to Ethan. She reconnected with old friends, apologized for her past behavior, and began rebuilding those relationships. One friend in particular, Jenna, had been close to Melissa since childhood, but had been pushed away when Melissa became consumed by her new life with Ethan. "I'm so glad you reached out," Jenna said when they met for coffee. "I've missed you." Melissa smiled, gratitude evident in her eyes. "I've missed you too. I'm sorry for how things ended between us. I let myself get caught up in a world that wasn't real." Jenna squeezed her hand reassuringly. "What's important is that you're here now, and it sounds like you've been through a lot." As they caught up, Melissa felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Sharing her journey with someone who knew her so well reinforced the lessons she had learned about humility and the value of true friendship. Back at home, Melissa and Clara continued to grow closer. They spent evenings cooking together, sharing stories, and laughing over memories that had long been tucked away. Melissa found herself opening up about her fears and dreams, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. "Do you ever think about starting your own business?" Clara asked one night as they tidied up the kitchen. Melissa considered the idea. "I suppose I have, but it always seemed impossible." "Nothing is impossible if you put your heart into it," Clara encouraged. "You've become quite the seamstress, and with your creativity, you could do amazing things." The idea sparked excitement in Melissa. "Maybe we could do something together. A mother-daughter boutique." Clara's face lit up. "I would love that." With a renewed sense of purpose, Melissa and Clara began making plans for their boutique. They discussed designs, target customers, and even scouted potential locations. The project brought them even closer, solidifying the bond that had been mended through forgiveness and understanding. One evening, as they worked late into the night sketching ideas, Melissa paused to look at her mother. "Mom, I want you to know how much this means to me," she said softly. "Not just the boutique, but everything. You've given me a second chance at happiness." Clara reached across the table to hold her daughter's hand. Seeing you find your joy again is all I've ever wanted. Melissa felt tears welling up. I couldn't have done it without you. You've taught me the true meaning of family, that it's about unconditional love, support, and always being there for each other. Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. Family is everything, and no matter what happens, we'll face it together. At that moment, Melissa realized that the home she had been searching for wasn't a place but a feeling. The warmth and security that came from being with the people who loved her unconditionally. She understood now that forgiveness had set her free, allowing her to embrace the future with hope and gratitude. Melissa's transformation was evident not only to Clara but also to everyone around her. She carried herself with a newfound confidence, her interactions laced with humility and warmth. The once prideful and guarded woman had become open and self-aware, her focus shifting from superficial accomplishments to meaningful connections. Her progress with the sewing apprenticeship became a point of pride. Melissa's stitches, once uneven and hesitant, now displayed a precision that impressed even Margaret, the boutique owner. Customers began requesting her personally for custom projects, a testament to her growing skill and determination. One day, Margaret pulled Melissa aside after her shift. "I've been watching how much you've grown, and I have to say, I'm proud of you," she said. "You've come a long way, and it's not just about the sewing. It's about how you've found yourself again." Melissa smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you. I owe so much of this to my mom. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Margaret nodded knowingly. Sometimes, it takes someone else's love to remind us of our own strength. Melissa's transformation extended beyond her work. She made a conscious effort to give back to the community that had supported her mother during her lowest moments. She began volunteering at the same soup kitchen Clara had frequented, helping to serve meals and sewing clothes for those in need. One afternoon, as she handed a warm meal to a young mother, the woman hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's been a hard week, but little acts of kindness like this make it easier." The words struck a chord with Melissa. She saw herself in the woman, lost, vulnerable, and in need of compassion. The realization deepened her resolve to continue her work, both in sewing and in service, as a way to honor her mother's example and give hope to others. As Melissa embraced her new life, she knew she couldn't fully move forward without addressing the wounds of her past. One day, as she cleaned up the shop after hours, she saw a familiar figure standing hesitantly at the door. Ethan. Melissa's heart stopped. The man who had once been the center of her world now looked smaller, his sharp suit unable to mask the weariness in his eyes. "Melissa," Ethan began, his voice unsure. "I heard you've been doing well. I thought I'd stop by to talk." Melissa stood tall, her composure steady. "What do you want, Ethan?" He hesitated, his gaze darting around the shop before finally settling on her. "I made a mistake. I should never have let you go. I was wrong, and I want to make things right." Melissa's mind swirled with emotions, but she remained calm. "You didn't just let me go, Ethan. You destroyed everything we built together. And I've spent every day since then trying to rebuild what you tore apart. Not for you, but for me and Oliver." Ethan stepped closer, desperation creeping into his tone. "We can start over. For our son's sake." Melissa shook her head. "Oliver deserves better than a man who only values people when it's convenient." "I do too." Ethan looked stunned, but Melissa's resolve was unshakable. For the first time, she saw Ethan for what he truly was. A man who thrived on control and charm, but crumbled in the face of genuine accountability. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "Oliver and I have a new life now, and there's no place for you in it." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but seemed to recognize the finality in her tone. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Melissa standing tall and free from the shadows of her past. Back at home, Melissa shared the encounter with Clara. "He actually thought I'd take him back," Melissa said, shaking her head, "but I didn't even feel tempted. I felt strong." Clara beamed with pride. "That's because you were strong, Melissa, and you've come so far. I hope you see that, Melissa nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I do. And it's because of you, Mom. You showed me how to stand tall, even when everything falls apart. The mother-daughter duo continued to work on their boutique dream, their bond growing stronger with every decision made and every fabric stitched. Melissa began to feel the joy of creating a future built on love, resilience, and mutual respect. A far cry from the life she had once pursued. Melissa's transformation rippled outward, touching everyone around her. She became a source of inspiration for the women in her apprenticeship group, for the customers who admired her work, and most importantly, for Clara and Oliver. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she had come and the strength she had found in the love of her mother. Melissa had always seen her mother as an unwavering pillar of strength, someone who bore life's hardships with quiet dignity and an unshakable faith. But as they sat together one evening in the soft glow of the kitchen light, Melissa realized there was so much she didn't know about Clara's journey. Mom, Melissa began hesitantly, you've always been there for me, but I don't think I ever asked how you managed after I made you leave. Clara looked up from her sewing, her hands pausing as a thoughtful expression crossed her face. She set the fabric aside and leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant but warm. It wasn't easy, she admitted, her voice steady but laced with emotion. There were nights when I felt like I had nothing left, but I also knew I couldn't give up. Not on myself and not on you. Clara began to share her story, the words spilling out like a confession Melissa hadn't realized she needed to hear. The first night after I left your house, I sat on a park bench with my suitcase, not knowing where to go, Clara said. I had no home, no family to turn to, and no idea how I was going to make it through the next day. The cold seeped into my bones, but it couldn't compare to the ache in my heart. Melissa's throat tightened as she imagined her mother alone, shivering in the dark. Eventually, I found a shelter, Clara continued. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest my head and think about my next steps. I met people there who were kind, who shared their stories and reminded me that I wasn't alone. Clara's voice softened. I found a job at the tailor shop soon after. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of purpose. And as I worked, I prayed. I prayed for you every day, Melissa, for your happiness, your safety, and for the strength to forgive. Melissa wiped away a tear, her voice trembling as she asked, How did you keep going, Mom? After everything I did to you? Clara reached out, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's. Because I loved you, Melissa. That love never went away, even when my heart was broken. And I knew that holding on to bitterness would only hurt us both. So I chose to let go of the pain and trust that life would bring us back together. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Melissa realized that her mother's strength came not from an absence of struggle, but from her ability to endure and rise above it. You're incredible, Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think I could have survived what you did. Clara smiled gently. You're stronger than you think, Melissa. And the fact that you're here now, rebuilding your life and our relationship, proves that. Hearing her mother's story deepened Melissa's gratitude and admiration for Clara. It also gave her a new perspective on her own struggles. She realized that while her journey had been painful, it had been nothing compared to the hardships Clara had faced alone. I've been so selfish, Melissa admitted, her voice cracking. You went through so much and I pushed you away. Clara shook her head. You've already asked for forgiveness, and I've already given it. What matters now is that we're here together. We've both been through our own battles, and we've come out stronger for it. Melissa nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time, she felt like she truly understood the depth of her mother's love, and how it had sustained them both through their darkest times. As they continued working on their plans for the boutique, Clara's story became a source of inspiration for Melissa. She wanted their business to reflect the resilience and love that had brought them back together. It's not just about sewing clothes, Melissa said one evening as they sketched ideas for their first collection. It's about creating something meaningful, something that reminds people of the strength they have inside. Clara's eyes sparkled with pride. Then let's make it happen. The boutique became more than just a project. It was a symbol of their shared resilience and the unbreakable bond between mother and daughter. Months of hard work and careful planning brought Clara and Melissa's dream to life. The small boutique, nestled on a charming street corner in the heart of their town, opened its doors to the community with little fanfare but plenty of heart. Inside, the space was cozy and inviting, with soft lighting highlighting racks of handmade garments and a few framed photographs of Clara and Melissa sewing together. The boutique's name, Threads of Grace, was Melissa's idea, inspired by the journey of forgiveness, resilience, and hope that had brought them to this moment. On the morning of the grand opening, Melissa stood in front of the boutique's mirror, adjusting a simple yet elegant dress she had sewn herself. Clara approached from behind, resting a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. Nervous? Clara asked with a knowing smile. Melissa nodded, her hands fidgeting. A little, but more than anything, I just want this to succeed. For both of us. Clara squeezed her shoulder. It already has, Melissa. Look at everything we've built together. This isn't just about selling clothes. It's about sharing our story and showing others that there's always a way forward. As the first customers trickled in, the boutique filled with a warm buzz of conversation. Friends, neighbors, and even a few of Melissa's old acquaintances stopped by to support the venture. Many of them commented on the beauty and craftsmanship of the garments, and some lingered to ask about the story behind the shop. Melissa shared bits and pieces of their journey, her voice steady but emotional. This boutique is about more than just clothes, she explained to one customer. It's about second chances and the strength of family. As the day went on, Clara and Melissa worked seamlessly together, greeting customers, adjusting displays, and taking special orders. Oliver, now a bubbly and curious toddler, toddled around the shop, earning adoring smiles from visitors. One moment in particular stood out to Melissa. A young woman approached the counter with tears in her eyes, holding a dress she had admired. This shop, it feels so different, the woman said softly. It's not just a store. It feels like hope, like everything can be okay again. Melissa felt her throat tighten as she exchanged a glance with Clara. That's exactly what we hoped it would be, she replied, her voice full of gratitude. That evening, after the boutique's doors had closed and the last customer had left, Clara and Melissa sat together in the quiet shop, basking in the glow of their accomplishment. We did it, Melissa said, her voice tinged with disbelief. I still can't believe we're here. Clara smiled, her hands folded in her lap. It's not just about the shop, Melissa. It's about the journey we took to get here. Every stitch, every decision, every moment. It's all a testament to how far we've come. Melissa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know where I'd be without you, Mom. You taught me how to be strong, how to forgive, and how to believe in myself again. Clara reached over and took her daughter's hand. And you taught me that love is worth fighting for. No matter how hard things get, family is always worth it. As they turned off the shop lights and locked the door for the night, both women felt a sense of peace and purpose they hadn't known in years. Together, they had transformed their pain into something beautiful. A boutique that wasn't just a business but a reflection of their love and resilience. For Melissa, the boutique was more than just a fresh start. It was proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, forgiveness, and the unwavering support of a mother's love. For Clara, it was a chance to see her daughter thrive, to witness the strength and kindness she had always known Melissa was capable of. Their future was no longer clouded by regret or doubt, but illuminated by the hope they had rediscovered together. As the seasons changed, so did the lives of Clara, Melissa, and little Oliver. The boutique, Threads of Grace, flourished, becoming more than just a shop. It became a hub for the community, a place where people felt inspired, supported, and connected. Melissa and Clara worked side by side each day, their bond stronger than ever, their shared laughter filling the space that once echoed with uncertainty. One quiet afternoon, Clara sat in the boutique's back room, sewing a custom order while Oliver played at her feet. Melissa watched from the doorway, a smile tugging at her lips. The sight of her mother, so focused and serene, filled her with gratitude. "Mom," Melissa said, stepping into the room, "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've taught me, about forgiveness, family, and resilience. I hope I can be half the mother to Oliver that you've been to me." Clara looked up, her eyes soft with emotion. "You already are, Melissa. The fact that you're here, working hard, and loving him with all your heart. That's what being a good mother is all about." Melissa sat beside her, taking her hand. "I used to think success was about what I could have, money, status, things. But now I see it's about who I have. You and Oliver are my greatest treasures." Clara smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And you are mine." As Melissa walked home with Oliver that evening, she reflected on the woman she had become. The journey hadn't been easy, but the lessons she learned had shaped her into someone she was finally proud to be. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't a weakness but a strength, one that required courage and compassion. She had learned that family, though imperfect, was the foundation upon which she could rebuild her life. And she had learned that love, true, unconditional love, was the greatest gift of all. One evening, Clara sat by the window of her small but cozy home, gazing out at the stars. She held a pen in her hand, writing in a journal she had kept since her days of hardship. Her words were simple but powerful. "Life will test us, often in ways we can't predict. But no matter how far we fall or how much we lose, there's always a way back. Love is the path, forgiveness is the key, and family is the light that guides us home." Clara closed the journal and smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. Her journey had been long and filled with trials, but it had also brought her the greatest gift of all: a daughter who had rediscovered the strength within herself and the love they shared. Years later, as the boutique continued to thrive and Oliver grew into a curious and kind-hearted boy, Clara and Melissa looked back on their journey with pride. Their story was one of redemption and transformation, a testament to the power of love and resilience. Though the scars of the past remained, they served as reminders of the strength they had found in one another. Together, they had turned their pain into something beautiful, building a future filled with hope, gratitude, and joy. And as they stood in the boutique one busy afternoon, welcoming customers with warm smiles, Clara and Melissa knew one thing for certain: no matter where life took them, they would always have each other.